The summer of 1942 burned across the vast, rolling steppes of southern Russia, a landscape baked hard under a relentless sun. A year had passed since the launch of Operation Barbarossa, and while the Wehrmacht had carved deep into the Soviet Union, its ultimate goal remained elusive. Moscow had not fallen. Leningrad was besieged but defiant. The war, which Adolf Hitler had envisioned as a lightning campaign, had bogged down into a grinding war of attrition that his Reich was ill-equipped to sustain. German fuel reserves were dwindling, a critical vulnerability that dictated the entire strategy for the coming months. Thus, a new grand design was conceived, a summer offensive codenamed Fall Blau, or Case Blue. Its objective was singular and vital: to seize the rich oil fields of the Caucasus. If Germany could capture the wells of Maikop, Grozny, and ultimately the sprawling complex at Baku, it would not only solve its own crippling fuel shortage, but would simultaneously deny the Soviets more than 80% of their oil, potentially collapsing their war effort entirely. The plan, laid out in Führer Directive No. 41 on April 5, 1942, was ambitious. Army Group South, the juggernaut of the German Eastern Front, was to be split in two. Army Group A would thrust deep into the Caucasus Mountains to capture the oil fields. Army Group B, under the command of General Maximilian von Weichs, was assigned a crucial, yet initially secondary, role. Its primary component, the formidable German Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, was to advance eastward to the great bend of the Don River. Its mission was to establish a defensive flank along the river and neutralize a city that, at first, was little more than a name on the map, a geographic anchor point to protect the main drive south. That city was Stalingrad. Originally named Tsaritsyn, it stretched for nearly 30 miles along the high western bank of the Volga River, a vital artery connecting the heart of Russia with its southern territories and the Caspian Sea. It was a major industrial center, its factories churning out T-34 tanks, artillery, and other armaments for the struggling Red Army. Capturing the city would sever Soviet transport links and disrupt the flow of Lend-Lease supplies arriving through Persia. But for one man, the city's importance transcended the strategic. For Adolf Hitler, its name was an irresistible lure, a symbol he felt compelled to eradicate. The city of Stalin would become a personal obsession, a fixation that would warp the very logic of Case Blue and draw the German war machine into a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. What began as a mission to secure a flank would, through the force of one man's will, transform into the campaign's primary objective, a matter of pure ideological prestige. Friedrich Paulus, the commander tasked with this momentous undertaking, was in many ways the archetypal German staff officer. Meticulous, intelligent, and deeply loyal, he had been instrumental in planning the invasion of the Soviet Union itself. He was not a hardened frontline commander in the mold of his more pugnacious peers, but an obedient and diligent strategist. This very nature, his unwavering adherence to the chain of command, would become a fatal flaw in the crucible that awaited him. His Sixth Army was one of the Wehrmacht's finest, a veteran force of over 250,000 men, flush with the confidence of past victories. As they began their advance in late June, the vast, open steppe seemed to welcome them. The initial phases of Case Blue were a stunning success. Soviet resistance, poorly organized and still reeling from the disasters of the previous year, crumbled. In Berlin, confidence soared. To deceive the Soviet High Command, the Germans had initiated a ruse, Operation Kremlin, designed to feign a renewed assault on Moscow. The deception worked. Joseph Stalin, convinced that the capital remained Germany's primary target, kept his strongest formations positioned around Moscow, leaving the southern front dangerously exposed. As the panzers of the Sixth Army raced across the plains, they devoured mile after mile of Soviet territory. But a worrying pattern emerged. The great pincer movements that had defined the Blitzkrieg of 1941 were closing on empty air. The Red Army, while battered, was not being destroyed. Under the direction of the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, their forces were conducting a strategic withdrawal, trading space for time, pulling their mauled armies back across the Don to avoid encirclement. The Germans mistook this tactical retreat for a total collapse, a failure of intelligence that bred a dangerous overconfidence. Hitler, increasingly impatient and micromanaging the campaign from his headquarters hundreds of miles away, made a fateful decision. Convinced the Soviets were all but finished, he split his forces further, ordering the 4th Panzer Army, which was meant to cover the 6th Army's southern flank and help take Stalingrad, to turn south and join Army Group A's push for the Caucasus. The two army groups, already tasked with divergent objectives, were now to advance with their flanks even more exposed. The concentration of force, the very principle of German military doctrine, was being abandoned. On July 28, 1942, as the German threat to the city became undeniable, Joseph Stalin issued one of the most brutal orders in military history. Order number 227, known by its famous and chilling slogan, "Not a step back," was read aloud to every soldier in the Red Army. It decried the retreatist mood and declared that to retreat further was to waste ourselves and to waste at the same time our motherland. The order was merciless in its provisions. Any commander who allowed an unauthorized withdrawal would face a court-martial. Penal battalions, or Strafbats, were to be formed from soldiers accused of cowardice or indiscipline and sent to the most suicidal sectors of the front. Most notoriously, it mandated the creation of blocking detachments, special NKVD units positioned behind the front lines with explicit orders to shoot any soldier, panic-mongers and cowards, who attempted to retreat. It was a decree born of desperation, an admission of the Red Army's fragile morale, but it codified a simple, terrifying reality for the Soviet soldier. The only path forward was into the fire of the German guns. To turn back meant certain death at the hands of their own comrades. In early August, Hitler reversed his earlier decision and redirected the 4th Panzer Army back towards Stalingrad. The advance now continued on two axes. By August 23rd, the ordeal of the city proper began. On that day, the 414th Panzer Corps of the 6th Army broke through to the Volga River just north of Stalingrad, effectively cutting the city off by land. Simultaneously, General von Richthofen's Luftflotte 4 unleashed a bombing campaign of terrifying intensity. Over 2,000 sorties were flown, dropping more than 1,000 tons of bombs and turning the sprawling city into a sea of fire and smoke. The wooden houses of the suburbs were incinerated, the sky turned black with ash, and the city was reduced to a skeletal landscape of shattered concrete and twisted steel. An estimated 40,000 civilians were killed in the first week of bombing alone. The Germans believed this overwhelming aerial assault would break the city's will to resist and allow for a swift capture. They were tragically mistaken. The inferno did not create a path to victory. It created the perfect battlefield for the defenders. The mountains of rubble, the collapsed factories, and the labyrinthine ruins provided a maze of defensive positions that negated the German superiority in tanks and combined arms tactics. The war of movement was over. What was about to begin was something new, something primordially savage. The Germans would come to call it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. On September 11th, 1942, a new commander arrived to take charge of the city's beleaguered defenders. Lieutenant General Vasily Chuikov was appointed head of the Soviet 62nd Army. He was a man of bulldog tenacity and iron will, born from peasant stock and forged in the crucible of the Russian Civil War. When he arrived at his new headquarters, a bunker on the west bank of the Volga, he was asked how he interpreted his task. His reply was blunt: "We will defend the city or die in the attempt." At that moment, his army was a shattered remnant, numbering just 20,000 men and a few dozen tanks, pressed back against the river by the full might of the Sixth Army. Facing a foe with overwhelming superiority in armor, artillery, and air power, Chuikov developed a simple but brutally effective tactical doctrine. He called it hugging the enemy. Soviet positions were to be kept as close to the German lines as possible, often only a grade's throw away. This tactic served two purposes. First, it neutralized the Luftwaffe and German artillery, as they could not bomb or shell the Soviet front line without risking hitting their own troops. Second, it forced the fighting into a series of intimate, close-quarters struggles in the ruins, a chaotic environment where the German technological advantage was minimized, and the grim, close-in fighting skills of the Soviet infantry could be maximized. On September 13th, the Germans launched their first major ground offensive into the city center. Their goal was the Mamayev Kurgan, a dominant hill in the city's heart that offered a commanding view of the entire area and the main railway station, Stalingrad 1. The fighting that erupted for these objectives was of an intensity that shocked even the most hardened veterans of the Eastern Front. The Mamayev Kurgan, designated height 102 inches on military maps, became a charnel house. Control of its summit changed hands multiple times, sometimes several times in a single day. The earth was so thoroughly churned by shells and bombs that it was said to contain more metal splinters than soil. The slopes were littered with the dead of both sides, a carpet of grey and brown uniforms frozen in the postures of their final agony. The fight for the railway station was just as vicious. German stormtroopers would clear a room, only to be attacked by Soviets who had emerged from the sewers or from hidden positions in the rubble. The station changed hands over a dozen times in a matter of days. Every street, every building, every floor, every cellar became a fortress to be assaulted. The nature of the combat was intimate and horrific. The primary fighting unit on both sides became the small storm group, a squad-sized team of 8 to 10 men armed with submachine guns, grenades, sharpened spades, and knives. German doctrine, which relied on the coordinated action of infantry, armor, and artillery, broke down completely in this chaotic, three-dimensional battlefield. Tanks that entered the narrow, rubble-choked streets were vulnerable to anti-tank rifles and Molotov cocktails from the floors above. Soviet snipers, taking advantage of the endless fields of fire offered by the ruins, waged a merciless war of attrition against German officers and any soldier careless enough to expose himself. Figures like Vasily Zaitsev, a shepherd from the Urals, became legends, their exploits amplified by Soviet propaganda to bolster the morale of the defenders. The city itself became a weapon. The grain elevator in the south, a massive concrete structure, was defended by a handful of Soviet Marines for nearly a week. They held out against repeated German assaults, their machine guns spitting fire from the high windows until the concrete around them was pockmarked and scarred, and the grain inside was mixed with the blood of attackers and defenders alike. To the north, the fighting centered on the massive factory district, a sprawling complex of industrial plants that had once been the pride of Soviet industry. The Red October tractor factory, the Barricadi gun factory, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor plant. Even as the battles raged around them, workers continued to repair tanks and weapons just yards from the front line, sometimes driving freshly repaired T-34s directly from the factory floor into combat. One particular building, a 4-story apartment block overlooking a square, became an immortal symbol of Soviet resistance. A platoon led by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov seized the building and, with a small garrison of men, turned it into an impregnable fortress. For nearly 2 months, Pavlov's house held out against relentless German attacks. The men surrounded it with minefields, knocked holes in the walls to create machine gun nests, and dug a communications trench back to their own lines. They were supplied with food and ammunition by boats that braved the Volga under constant German artillery and air attack. On Paulus's field maps, the building was circled and marked simply as a fortress. The defenders held out for longer than the German army had taken to conquer France. For the German soldiers of the 6th Army, Stalingrad was a descent into hell. They were masters of a war of sweeping movement, and now they were trapped in a claustrophobic, meat-grinding battle of inches. Letters home spoke of the horror. One soldier wrote, "Stalingrad is no longer a town. By day it is a cloud of burning, blinding smoke. It is a vast furnace. Animals flee this burning hell. The hardest stones cannot bear it for long. Only men endure." Their casualties were staggering. Divisions were reduced to the strength of battalions, battalions to companies. The elite pioneer battalions, specialists in assault and demolition, were bled white in the endless house-to-house fighting. As October bled into November, the Germans had, at a terrible cost, pushed the defenders back into a few narrow slivers of land along the western bank of the Volga. At some points, the Soviet-held territory was only a few hundred yards deep. Chuikov's 62nd Army was clinging to life by a thread, supplied only by the perilous nightly ferry across the ice-choked river. It seemed to the German command that one final push would be enough to finish the job, to finally cast the last defenders into the Volga. They believed they were on the verge of victory. They were, in fact, walking into the jaws of one of the greatest traps in the history of warfare. While the German 6th Army was being bled dry in the ruins of the city, a far grander drama was unfolding on the vast steppes to the north and south. The Soviet Stavka, under the overall direction of Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, had been quietly gathering a massive strategic reserve. The German obsession with taking the city itself had caused them to neglect their flanks. The long, overstretched lines of Army Group B were held not by elite German troops, but by their less equipped and less motivated allies, the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies, the 8th Italian Army, and the 2nd Hungarian Army. These armies lacked sufficient anti-tank guns, their morale was low, and they were spread thinly across a huge front. For months, the Stavka had been meticulously planning a massive counter-offensive, codenamed Operation Uranus. The plan was a classic double envelopment, a pincer movement on a colossal scale, reminiscent of the German army's own greatest victories. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers, supported by nearly 900 new T-34 tanks and over 1,100 aircraft, were secretly massed on the flanks of the German position. The deception was elaborate. To mask the build-up, troops and equipment were moved only at night. Defensive fortifications were built in the open to fool German reconnaissance, and the whole operation was conducted under the strictest radio silence. Stalin, in a rare act of delegation, had finally learned to trust his generals, giving Zhukov and Vasilevsky the authority to plan and execute the operation without his constant interference. On November 19th, 1942, in the midst of a driving snowstorm, the northern pincer of Operation Uranus was unleashed. A thunderous artillery barrage, with thousands of guns and Katyusha rocket launchers, tore into the positions of the Third Romanian Army. When the bombardment lifted, waves of Soviet infantry and armor surged forward. The Romanian defenses, lacking the heavy anti-tank weapons needed to stop the T-34 collapsed almost immediately. Soldiers abandoned their positions and fled in panic. The Soviet tank corps plunged deep into the German rear, their columns racing across the frozen steppe, appearing where the German command least expected them. The German command was caught completely by surprise. They had received some intelligence of a possible Soviet attack, but had dismissed it, convinced the Red Army was incapable of mounting an offensive on this scale. A day later, on November 20th, the southern pincer struck the Fourth Romanian Army, with the same devastating results. The front dissolved. On November 23rd, just 4 days after the offensive began, the lead tank brigades of the two Soviet pincers met at the town of Kalach-na-Donu, west of Stalingrad. The trap had closed. The entire German Sixth Army, parts of the Fourth Panzer Army, and the surviving remnants of the Romanian divisions, a force of somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 men, were now encircled. A vast pocket, stretching 50 kilometers from east to west, had been created. Inside it was Friedrich Paulus and his army, cut off and surrounded. The immediate reaction at Hitler's headquarters was a mixture of disbelief and fury. The logical military move was for the Sixth Army to immediately attempt to break out to the west, to fight its way out of the developing encirclement before the Soviet ring could solidify. Indeed, Paulus's staff began to prepare for such an operation. But the order from the Führer was absolute and unequivocal. The Sixth Army was to stand fast. It was to form an all-round defense, a fortress, and await relief. Hitler declared that the trapped army would be supplied from the air. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, gave a rash and catastrophic promise. He assured Hitler that his air force could deliver the necessary supplies to keep the Sixth Army fighting. He claimed they could fly in 500 tons of supplies per day, the minimum amount the army staff calculated was needed to maintain combat effectiveness. It was a promise born of arrogance and ignorance, completely untethered from reality. The Luftwaffe simply did not have the transport aircraft, the experienced crews, or the forward airfields to mount an operation of this magnitude, especially in the brutal Russian winter. The leaders on the ground, like Wolfram von Richthofen, commander of Luftflotte 4, knew it was impossible and protested, but they were overruled. Hitler, clinging to the idea of holding the city on the Volga at all costs, seized upon Göring's fantasy. The fate of the Sixth Army was sealed. The airlift, which began in late November, was a disaster from the start. The daily requirement was at least 300 tons, simply to keep the men from starving. The Luftwaffe, on its best days, managed to deliver just over 100 tons. On many days, due to blizzards, freezing fog, or intense Soviet fighter opposition, nothing got through at all. The primary transport plane, the venerable but slow Junkers Ju-52, was easy prey for Soviet fighters. The airfields inside the pocket, first at Pitomnik and later at Gumrak, were under constant artillery fire and were often unusable due to snow and ice. For the men inside the Kessel, or cauldron, as the pocket was called, life became a slow-motion nightmare of starvation and freezing. Rations were cut again and again. The daily bread ration shrank to 200 grams, then 100, and finally to less than 50 grams, a few mouthfuls of sawdust-filled bread. The horses were the first to be eaten. Then came the dogs and cats. As the weeks wore on, whispers of cannibalism began to circulate in the frozen cellars and dugouts. The cold was as merciless an enemy as the Soviets. Temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius and beyond. Soldiers lacked proper winter clothing. Frostbite was rampant. Men froze to death in their foxholes. The wounded, crammed into unheated cellars with no medical supplies, died in their thousands. Lice, filth, and disease were everywhere. Discipline began to break down. The army that had marched so proudly to the Volga was slowly and inexorably being destroyed by hunger and cold. In mid-December, a final hope for the trapped army appeared on the horizon. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most brilliant commanders, assembled a relief force, Army Group Don, for an operation codenamed Winter Storm, Unternehmen Wintergewitter. Attacking from the southwest, Manstein's panzer divisions fought their way through the Soviet outer lines in a desperate bid to reach the pocket. By December 19th, the spearhead of the relief force had reached a point just 30 miles from Paulus's perimeter. Communication was established. Manstein sent an urgent message to Paulus, imploring him to launch a breakout attempt to the southwest to meet the relief force halfway. It was the Sixth Army's last chance. But Paulus, a man shackled by his ingrained obedience, agonized. He radioed Hitler for permission to break out. The reply was the same as before: hold your positions. Without a direct order from the Führer, Paulus would not act. He was afraid of the responsibility, afraid of disobeying the man to whom he had sworn an oath of absolute loyalty. The moment passed. Soviet reinforcements were rushed to block Manstein's advance, and the exhausted relief force was thrown back. The last hope was extinguished. The fate of the Sixth Army was now certain. As the new year of 1943 began, the Soviets launched their final offensive to liquidate the pocket, Operation Ring, Koltso. On January 8th, they offered Paulus terms of surrender. He radioed Hitler, reporting the desperate situation and requesting freedom of action. The request was denied. So on January 10th, a massive Soviet artillery bombardment signaled the beginning of the end. The emaciated, frostbitten, and virtually ammunitionless German soldiers could offer little effective resistance. The pocket began to shrink rapidly. On January 16th, the main airfield at Pitomnik was overrun, ending even the pretense of an airlift. The remaining German forces were split into two smaller pockets, one in the south centered around the ruins of the Univermag department store where Paulus had his headquarters, and a northern pocket in the rubble of the tractor factory. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of the Nazi seizure of power, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. It was not an honor, it was a command. No German Field Marshal in history had ever surrendered. The implication was clear. Paulus was expected to commit suicide, but Paulus refused to die for a meaningless gesture. On the morning of January 31st, 1943, Soviet soldiers entered the basement of the Univermag department store. They found a tall, twitching, and defeated man. Friedrich Paulus, the first field marshal in German history to do so, surrendered. 2 days later, on February 2nd, the last remnants of the northern pocket laid down their arms. The battle for Stalingrad was over. Of the nearly 300,000 men encircled in November, some 91,000 were taken into captivity. The rest were dead. The fate of the prisoners was horrific. Starved and weakened, they were forced on death marches to camps hundreds of miles away. Ill-equipped to handle such a massive influx of prisoners, the Soviets could provide little food or medical care. In the weeks and months that followed, disease, starvation, and neglect claimed tens of thousands more. Of the 91,000 who surrendered at Stalingrad, only about 5,000 would ever see Germany again. The battle was arguably the bloodiest in human history, with total casualties for both sides estimated to be close to 2 million. The city of Stalingrad was a ghost, a wasteland of rubble and corpses, but it had held. The defeat was a catastrophe from which the German war machine on the Eastern Front would never recover. An entire army, one of its best, had been wiped off the map. The loss of equipment was staggering, but the loss of experienced soldiers and officers was irreplaceable. Psychologically, the impact was profound. For the first time, the myth of German invincibility was shattered, not just for the world, but for the German people themselves. The tide of the war had turned. From Stalingrad onward, the Wehrmacht would be almost constantly in retreat, pushed back inexorably towards Berlin by a resurgent Red Army that now held the strategic initiative. The victory galvanized the Soviet Union, its people, and its allies, providing a powerful symbol of resistance and the promise of ultimate victory. In the smoldering, frozen ruins of the city that bore Stalin's name, Hitler's ambition had met its match in the iron will of a defiant people, and the path to the downfall of the Third Reich had been irrevocably set.